On the morning of October 25, 1944, off the coast of a Philippine island called Samar, a Japanese lookout aboard the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built by any nation on Earth, spotted something on the horizon that made no sense. A single American destroyer, a ship 1/20th the size of Yamato, was not retreating. It was turning directly toward the entire Imperial Japanese battle fleet, laying smoke and accelerating to flank speed. That ship was the USS Johnston. Its captain, Commander Ernest E. Evans, had said something to his crew exactly 1 year earlier, the day he took command, that none of them had forgotten. "This is going to be a fighting ship," he told them. "I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." No one got off. What happened in the 2 hours that followed would become one of the most one-sided naval engagements in history on paper, and one of the most complete tactical victories in history in practice. 4 American destroyers and destroyer escorts, screening 6 small escort carriers, found themselves standing alone between the entire main battle fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the beachhead of General Douglas MacArthur's return to the Philippines. This is the story of the sailors who refused to sink with their ship, and the Japanese admiral who, staring at the wreckage of what should have been an easy victory, turned his fleet around and sailed away. To understand what Ernest Evans and the sailors of Taffy 3 were actually facing on the morning of October 25th, you need to understand the scale of the mismatch because it is almost impossible to overstate. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, steaming south through the San Bernardino Strait, consisted of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Leading them was the Yamato herself. Over 72,000 tons, armed with 9 18.1-inch guns, each shell weighing more than a small car, each capable of destroying an American destroyer with a single direct hit from a range the American ships could not even return fire across. Standing against this fleet was Task Unit April 3rd 77, radio call sign Taffy 3. 6 small escort carriers never designed for surface combat, 3 destroyers, and 4 smaller destroyer escorts. None of Taffy 3's ships carried a gun larger than 5 inches. Their shells, at 54 pounds each, could not penetrate the armor plating of a single Japanese cruiser, let alone a battleship. Their carriers had a top speed of 18 knots, dramatically slower than the 30-knot Japanese cruisers and destroyers now bearing down on them. By every mathematical measure the United States Navy had ever used to calculate the outcome of a surface engagement, this was not a battle. It was, by any reasonable military logic, already over before the first shot was fired. Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet, the force that should have been guarding the San Bernardino Strait, had been drawn away hours earlier, lured north by a Japanese decoy force, built almost entirely of empty aircraft carriers, with barely any planes left to fly. It was, in effect, one of history's most successful deceptions, and it had worked perfectly. Kurita's battle line had slipped through the strait in the dead of night and emerged at dawn to find nothing standing between his guns and the entire Leyte invasion force except 6 escort carriers and 7 small screening ships that were never built, never armed, and never intended to fight a battleship fleet in the open ocean. There was no secret weapon aboard the USS Johnston that morning. There was no hidden technology, no classified breakthrough, nothing in her specifications that explains what happened next. What happened next came entirely from a decision made by one man in the first minutes after the impossible came into view. At 0658, Japanese shells began landing around Taffy 3's carriers. Commander Evans, without waiting for orders from his task unit commander, gave the command that would define the battle. Hard left rudder, flank speed. Johnston turned directly into the Japanese fleet, laying a smokescreen to shield the carriers she was escorting, and began closing the distance to a battle line that outgunned her by a margin so extreme it barely registered as a fair comparison. Johnston's gunnery officer, Ensign Robert Hagen, opened fire on the lead Japanese heavy cruisers at 18,000 yards, registering hits with the ship's small 5-inch guns even as Japanese shell splashes began bracketing the destroyer on every side. Evans pressed the attack, closing to torpedo range under sustained fire from ships that could have ended Johnston with a single well-placed hit, and at close range launched all 10 of Johnston's torpedoes at the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano. At least one struck home, tearing off Kumano's entire bow and knocking her permanently out of the fight. A mission cruiser, one of the most powerful warships in the Imperial Japanese Navy, disabled by a single American destroyer that, by every rule of naval warfare, should never have survived long enough to fire. Inspired by Johnston's charge, the destroyers Hull and Heermann and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts followed her into the Japanese battle line, making their own torpedo runs through a wall of shell splashes that should have annihilated them in minutes. Overhead, aircraft from the escort carriers came off their decks with whatever ordnance they had left. Bombs, torpedoes, and when those ran out, depth charges dropped simply to force the Japanese ships to maneuver and break their firing solutions. It was, in the words of naval historians who studied the action afterward, an act of coordinated, almost suicidal aggression from a task unit that had every tactical justification to simply run. Evans was wounded early in the fight, shrapnel tearing away 2 fingers on his left hand. He stayed on the bridge. When Johnston's own torpedoes were exhausted and one of her engines was disabled, and orders came down for a further torpedo run by the remaining destroyers, Evans sent Johnston in anyway, not to fire torpedoes she no longer had, but to draw fire away from ships that still did. There is no chapter in this story about superior American technology, because the technology was never the point, and that is precisely what makes the battle off Samar remarkable. The technical supremacy on display that morning was not a weapon system. It was a doctrine. The same doctrine of independent, aggressive initiative under fire that appears again and again across American military engagements of the era, translated here into a naval context where the mismatch in raw firepower was more extreme than almost any other battle of the war. Johnston, alone, absorbed the concentrated fire of multiple Japanese cruisers and destroyers for nearly 2 hours before she finally went down. Japanese destroyers eventually stripped away her main mast, disabled her last operating engine, silenced her last gun, and rendered her bridge uninhabitable, forcing Evans to direct the fight from the fantail with the ship burning around him. It was only then, with Johnston splitting apart along a hull already struck by an 18-inch shell from Yamato herself, that Evans gave the order to abandon ship at 0945. What the technical mismatch could not account for was the psychological effect of an enemy that refused to behave the way a defeated force is supposed to behave. Kurita's own after-action assessment, later analyzed by American naval historians, describes exactly this failure of expectation. Determined, aggressive attacks of the American destroyers, combined with the ongoing carrier airstrikes, reinforced Kurita's mistaken belief that he was not facing a handful of escort carriers and destroyers at all, but the powerful carriers and cruisers of the American Third Fleet itself. Every torpedo run Johnston and her sister ships made did not just damage Japanese ships. It fed directly into an assessment that was already convincing Kurita he was walking into a trap far larger than the one he had actually found. That is the technical supremacy this battle actually demonstrates. Not a gun, not an armor plate, not a propulsion system. The demonstrated willingness of heavily outgunned American crews to attack rather than withdraw, repeatedly, under fire that should have ended the engagement in the first 15 minutes. Until the accumulated weight of that aggression convinced an enemy admiral commanding one of the most powerful fleets ever assembled that he could not afford to keep pressing an attack he was, in reality, already winning. At 0911, in the middle of the engagement, Yukikaze, one of the Japanese destroyers that had helped finish off Johnston, sailed slowly past the sinking American ship. Her crew did not open fire again. Survivors in the water watched as Japanese sailors lined the destroyer's deck, and her commander, Terachi Masamichi, raised his hand in salute to the American ship going down. Evans, seen briefly in a lifeboat, was reported by survivors to have returned the salute, tears on his face, before he was never seen again. Johnston rolled over and sank just after 1,000 hours. Of her crew of 327 men, 186 died, including Commander Evans, whose body was never recovered. The 141 survivors spent nearly 50 hours in the water before rescue reached them. And then, at almost the exact moment Johnston disappeared beneath the surface, Admiral Kurita made the decision that would define the entire Pacific War's final chapter. Staring at a battle line that had lost 3 heavy cruisers, watched several battleships take damage, and endured nearly 2 hours of what he genuinely believed was combat against a major American fleet, Kurita turned his ships around and withdrew back through the San Bernardino Strait, abandoning his mission to destroy the invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf entirely. He had, by every material measure, been winning. His battle line still vastly outgunned what remained of Taffy 3, and he retreated anyway. The cost to the Imperial Japanese Navy from that single morning was catastrophic and permanent. 3 heavy cruisers were sunk outright or damaged beyond meaningful repair. Nearly every capital ship in Kurita's force that survived the engagement returned to port and never sailed in a major offensive action again for the remainder of the war. The Japanese Navy, as a fighting force capable of contesting the open ocean, effectively ceased to exist as of that morning off Samar. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later write that the survival and success of Taffy 3 was nothing short of what he called special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. Historians have called it without much argument one of the greatest last stands in the history of naval warfare. There is a photograph, taken the day Ernest Evans took command of the USS Johnston, showing him standing on the ship's fantail in front of his assembled crew, delivering the words that would define what came next. He could not have known, standing there in Seattle in October of 1943, that those words were not a slogan. They were a battle plan. A year later, in the waters off Samar, he executed that plan exactly as he had promised it, against odds that no naval commander before or since has been expected to survive, let alone prevail against. Ernest E. Evans became the first Native American in United States Navy history to receive the Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously for a battle he did not survive, aboard a ship that does not exist anymore in service of an invasion beachhead that held because he and his crew decided, in the span of a few impossible minutes, that turning away was simply not an option available to them. The Presidential Unit Citation awarded to Taffy 3 does not describe strategy or technology. It describes men who looked at the largest battleship ever built, understood exactly what their 5-inch guns could and could not do to it, and closed the distance anyway. That is the story the Imperial Japanese Navy carried with it for the rest of the war. Not the story of a battle it lost on paper, because on paper it never should have lost at all. It is the story of an admiral who had every material advantage a commander could ask for, and who retreated because the men in front of him refused to fight like a defeated force is supposed to fight. The sailors of the USS Johnston did not sink with their ship because they had no choice. They went down fighting because Ernest Evans had told them, a year earlier, exactly what kind of ship they were serving on, and every man aboard had chosen to stay.